Hello and welcome to our first and what's probably going to be our only lecture of the semester, since this class is more of a seminar style class. Primarily, of course, if you've read through the syllabus, you'll see that most of the class and the entire semester is based on readings and class discussion. And typically in a seminar style class, you won't have any lectures, and typically you don't have any exams, at least in the traditional sense. And the reason why, though, I decided to have a lecture in the very first week of class is to make sure that everyone is on the same page in regards to these core components of what makes a theory, what is a theory, and in particular, what is a criminological theory. Throughout this semester, you're going to see and read a lot about what goes into a theory, and in particular, you're going to start seeing, once we get into week 2, 3, and 4, some of these key differences between some of these major criminological theories that you're going to be exposed to. And especially understanding these key aspects of what a concept is will help you understand the building blocks of what goes into a theory, and then that's going to help really understand and differentiate one theory from another. And in particular, the reason why, again, I do this is to make sure that everybody is on the same page. One of the things with this class is there's no requirement or any prerequisite that you should know anything about criminological theory, and especially theory in general. And the other thing, too, is a lot of people throw around the word theory in everyday use, but they don't really delve into what exactly it means. So that's what we're going to break down today, and it's just going to be a quick lecture and a quick overview of what some of these primary components are that go into making a theory, and then this is going to help you dissect each of your readings throughout the rest of the semester, so that way everybody, again, is kind of on the same page. So there are a lot of different explanations to really help us understand why someone does and does not commit a crime. And those are two important approaches and different approaches in how we can understand why people commit a crime. Oftentimes, criminological theory focuses on why someone does commit a crime. So that means we're looking at criminals, or we're looking at it from one perspective that, hey, these are people that are committing crime, so let's figure out why they're committing crime. Makes sense. The other side of that coin is looking at criminal behavior from the perspective of why people do not commit a crime. And again, that sounds like it's similar, but it's really different. So instead of looking at the criminals, you're looking at the non-criminals. You're looking at a different subpopulation, or really actually a different population there if you want to think about it in those terms. So again, even framing that question of why someone commits a crime, or why someone does not commit a crime, really has some different implications, and really some important implications. And as you all know, there are numerous ways to really explain why people commit a crime and why people don't commit a crime. Odds are most of you in this class have not committed a crime for which at least you have been arrested and may be adjudicated for. You might have, and that's completely fine. But there's odds are that most of you, though, have not. And odds are, though, most of you have committed a crime, you just haven't gotten caught for it. And because we have to think about that in that manner, we have to look at breaking down, again, maybe what is stopping you from committing or continuing the criminal behavior that you may have done. I know there's some research that suggests about 90% of U.S. citizens have committed a crime that they probably should have been arrested and tried for. But odds are, as you all know, most people are not caught, at least. It's those that continue it. So again, looking at some of these possible explanations for why people commit crime, you might have heard that it could be because of drugs, or it could be because of their bad upbringing, or it could be because of the neighborhood in which they grew up in, or it could be because they have low self-control, or they have stress in their life in some way. There are all different types of reasons and explanations. Some people even suggests that it is a biological cause, that some people are born a criminal, or you're born with certain criminal behaviors. And those are all logical explanations. And they're all different explanations. And we have different schools of thought that, again, go into why people commit crime. And that's what we're going to break down throughout this semester. The other thing I want you to keep in mind is that there's really not a shortcut to thinking about criminal behavior, but one shortcut, even though I said kind of contradict myself there, there's not really a shortcut, but one thing that a lot of people use to help kind of get down at the nuts and the bolts as to why somebody's committing a crime is to think about what benefits could come from that. So you think about, what good, and that's what I mean by benefit, is what good. So if they steal something, is it because they're going to get money? That's the benefit. Well, I'm going to get money, so perhaps they can use that money to buy drugs. Or if they commit a sex offense, you could maybe look at it from the standpoint that there's going to be some type of sexual gratification perhaps that they're receiving from it. Or maybe it's the power control aspect of committing that sexual offense that a lot of feminist literature suggests is received by those who commit sex offenses. So regardless of what the offense type is, it could be white-collar crime, it could be a simple theft, it could be assault, for example, like a physical assault. For example, say if you got into a fight with someone, or you just decided to beat up somebody and target them, you might just feel good by beating that person up. That's a crime, of course, but there is still some type of benefit that is perceived from coming from that behavior. So again, really one of the easiest and kind of quick fixes, at least, to look at and help understand why somebody commits a crime is looking at that motive there. I always tell students in my class, because I tend to view crime from a certain camp, which I won't reveal till later on in the semester, but one of the main reasons, especially for the types of crime that I study from my career, is I always say follow the money. If you look at who's going to benefit, especially off of white-collar crime, or if you look at a critical perspective of crime, which we'll talk about later on in the semester, if you think about following the money, then you're usually going to follow, or at least it's going to reveal who committed that crime, or what people would stand to benefit from that crime occurring. But the one thing I do want to make sure that you keep in mind throughout this is, even though breaking it down to what benefits could come from this behavior, whatever that criminal behavior might be, motivation isn't everything. There are different factors at play, and we're going to break down some of those factors throughout the semester, but I'm going to get back to that point here in just a second. The other thing I want you to think about as we go throughout the semester, there's really three primary reasons why theory is important. One of those is it helps us understand more about our world. So, of course, by being able to tie things together in a logical manner, in a coherent manner, it is going to help us understand more about our world. And because of that, theory is important. Because again, it's helping us tie together a lot of different information, and again, not only this, helping tie together all that information, the other aspect of that is we can test it. If you've ever heard of a hypothesis, which I'm sure all of you have heard of, and I know that was something that was beaten into my head as a middle schooler and high schooler, a hypothesis is a testable statement, and a theory is just a little bit more complex than that. But the gist of it is it's still a testable statement. We're tying together an explanation for why someone's doing something or why they're not doing something, and we're going to have a way to test it. The second reason why theory is important, or at least a primary reason why it's important, is it helps us understand more about the intersection of crime and important social issues. For example, it could be crime and poverty. That's one thing that you hear about all the time. It could be crime and drug use, that you hear about that all the time. It could be crime and mental illness. That can be something. It could be crime and homelessness. It could be crime and politics. It could be crime and money. It could be literally crime and race or ethnicity, or crime and gender. There's really any anything that you hear in the news, any of these major social issues that never seem to go away, and some are emerging, some are changing, all of those can and do intersect with crime. Every single one of them. They might seem like independent issues, but they are always connected, especially things like poverty. Poverty and crime, historically, especially in the United States, have always been connected with one another. And again, having a theory, especially something like from the critical perspective, which we'll talk about later on in the semester, that is going to help us understand more about why certain people commit perhaps more crime than others, or why things might be categorized as a crime. For example, the critical perspective of criminology looks at crime from the standpoint of the haves and the have-nots. That sounds familiar, it's very similar to Karl Marx's work in the Communist Manifesto, and that's essentially saying that those that are in power are going to be the ones that make the rules, and those that are not in power, of course, are not going to make the rules. So those that are in power are going to make rules that keep them in power, and it makes sense. So from that theoretical perspective, it's saying that those that are in power are going to pretty much criminalize behaviors of those that are poor. And again, that's a way to perhaps lock them up, keep them under control, maybe even stigmatize them in a certain way, even something like giving someone a felony for a crime, and that prohibits people from getting about 800 different occupations in our country. And the reason why that's important is that essentially will kill them from a social standpoint from being able to move up the social ladder, especially from a financial standpoint. So again, there are a variety of ways that you can look at crime and why people commit crime, and oftentimes it's because they are intersecting with these important social issues that I mentioned a second ago. And that's something that your readings throughout this semester are going to make abundantly clear, and especially the discussion posts that we're going to have throughout the semester are going to make abundantly clear. The third thing, and this is what's also important for this class, is it helps us develop ways to counter crime by developing prevention, intervention, and treatment methods. So this can be from an individual standpoint. Maybe you're looking at an individual that you're wanting to change their criminal behavior. For example, we have a treatment method right now that's called cognitive behavioral therapy, and it comes from a theoretical perspective that helps us understand. It's more of a psychological perspective, but it helps us understand why people do commit crimes, and oftentimes that is linked to their thought processes and patterns. So, for example, one of my main areas of research is sex offenses and offenders. So with sex offenses and offenders, especially sex offenders, there's a certain process that goes into them committing a sexual crime. And because of that, the main treatment method that has actually been found time and time again to be successful is cognitive behavioral therapy. If we didn't have a theory that underscored that treatment and the development of that treatment, it would not exist. And I want to give a little bit of a background about myself and as to why this third thing, at least in my viewpoint, is so important. So I originally went to grad school for sociology because my undergraduate is in history and in sociology. And I got a minor in criminology. And I always liked crime and criminology, and that's primarily what I was going to focus on. But I remember sitting in some of my first sociology classes, and I was pretty perturbed by a couple of the people in class based on some of the stuff they wanted to study. And it was interesting things and all of that. But what really kind of got at me was, okay, why? There's that question of why are you wanting to study what you're studying? And there are two different camps in our field, in our discipline. There's one that primarily looks at theory from the standpoint of, well, it just leads to knowledge building. So essentially we are studying this and we're coming up with theories so we can just know more about our topic, know more about whatever it is that we're studying. That's one camp. The other camp is, yeah, I want to know theory because I want to affect positive change. I want to take that theory that we're developing, and I often say that theory is kind of up in the clouds, it's kind of abstract, and I want to pull it down to the real world and affect positive change. So, okay, we have this theory of why people are committing crime, and we know some possible solutions to prevent having people not commit crime. So, there's those, and I tend to fall in that camp. I'll go ahead and reveal my biases there, where, okay, let's take that theory, that abstract concept from the clouds, and affect positive change. So, those are really those two camps. And I tend to fall more on this is beyond the scope of this class, but I tend to fall on in the camp of more of a criminal justice scholar than a criminological scholar, even though some people argue they're the same. There is some distinct differences there, and I'm more in the criminal justice aspect, and that's pretty much the more applied approach. So just to give you a little heads up with that. And you'll also see that, especially throughout the discussion posts and throughout some of the assignment prompts, that is kind of the angle that I take, is taking that applied approach of criminology, or the abstract approach of criminology, and then applying it through more of that criminal justice approach, if you will. So now we need to get into a theory. So what is a theory? And what I want you to think about is, think of a theory like building a house. There's a lot of individual elements to a crime. That can be your motivation, that could be your upbringing, that could be perhaps an addiction like a drug addiction or alcoholism being present, etc. There are a lot of different elements. One of them is, we know mostly men commit crime. So that's an element there. You can look at race or ethnicity, and then that can be tied to the structural elements of the neighborhood in which individuals are from and what they're being taught. So that gets us into social learning and all these other things. All of those little components, and there's tons more that I left out. Think of those like building supplies for a house. So that can be your lumber, that can be your PVC pipes, that can be your concrete, that can be bricks, whatever. I don't know much about construction, but you get the gist of it. So what you want when you're building is a house is all of those little things like concrete. You want maybe some type of, again, wood, bonding, all these other things like that. You want all of those elements to come together. PVC pipes, because you want plumbing. You want all those elements to come together to eventually form a house, because that's why you're building it. Same thing with baking. If you're making something like cake, it's usually eggs, milk, flour, sugar, things like that. Those are the basic components of it. But it's how you tie those things together depends on what your final product's going to be. And the same thing applies to criminological theories. You have a lot of individual elements, and it depends on what elements you choose, which ones you leave out, which ones in what order you put it in, and that can lead to a different final product. So what a theory does is it ties all those elements together, all those individual elements, as to why perhaps someone does believe that someone does or does not commit a crime, and is turning it into a final product such as a house, or if you want to follow the baking analogy, it could be a brownie, it could be a cupcake, it could be a cake, whatever the case is. So you get what I'm saying. It has to have these individual elements. And in order for them to have those individual elements, you have to understand concepts, which is what we're going to talk about here in just a second. So the general definition of a theory that I want you to be sure that you know is, a theory is a set of interrelated and or intercorrelated concepts or propositions used to explain a behavior. Now, I took, I believe, 7 different theory classes throughout my undergraduate, my graduate, and my graduate career. So I was in college for a total of 9 years between my bachelor's, my master's, and my PhD, and I took 7 or so, roughly, different classes on theory. And it wasn't until my very last theory class, when I was getting my PhD, that this definition of theory was presented to me, and in my mind, this made more sense than any other definition of theory that I came across. And we're going to break down what this definition means, because I believe it is crucial, especially as many of you are being exposed to theory for the very first time in this class. So again, a theory is a set of interrelated and or intercorrelated concepts or propositions that are used to explain a behavior. So I want you to keep in mind concepts, because that's what we're going to discuss next. A concept is an abstraction from reality. So again, it's an abstraction from reality. I'll give you some examples of a concept. One concept is anger. Does anger exist? Absolutely. You all know it exists. Does stress exist? Absolutely. You know that stress exists. Does happiness exist? Absolutely. It does exist. It does. You might not think it exists as common as something like anger or stress, but it does exist. Does contentment exist? Does contempt exist? There's all different types of feelings and emotions. Those are concepts. Those are abstractions from reality. Can you see anger? Actual anger. Can you see that? No. You might see somebody, grit their teeth or scream or tense up. That's a manifestation of anger. That's a physical manifestation of anger. But you can't see, touch, taste, feel, smell, any of that. You can't apply that to anger or happiness. You might see somebody smile or laugh, and that might indicate that they're happy or they're likely happy, or at least they're presenting that emotion to you. But again, you can't see, touch, taste, smell, or feel happiness or any of these concepts. Think of something like what we're going to discuss in a couple weeks, like low self-control. Now, self-control, you might say, I always hear people say, oh, I have low self-control, and they might not mean it in the context that we do when we're talking about the general theory of crime that Goffredson and Hershey created. But the thing, and the reason why that is important is we have to find a way to measure that, to measure low self-control. Is that maybe that you're you don't really think about anything beyond the next day? I know a lot of people. My wife, for example, is the type of person that kind of flies by the seat of her pants. She doesn't plan out the day. She doesn't plan out the next day. And she's just kind of a go with the flow type. And I'm the polar opposite. I have to have everything planned to a T. I have to have my entire day planned. And if one thing goes wrong, I freak out. I just absolutely freak out. So we might measure low self-control and being somebody like more on my wife's end, where it's, compulsive buying. I have buyer's remorse, for example. So it's a different thing with that. But again, you probably can't tie that to low self-control. But maybe compulsive buying is one of those. Gambling could perhaps be tied in with low self-control. There's a lot of elements that you can get at. How many of you have ever taken a survey before and they ask you 5 or 10 questions that you're pretty sure are the same questions? They're just reworded a little bit differently. That's a way that we're trying to get at reliability. We're trying to get at both reliability, and we're also trying to get at, are we really measuring what we're thinking that we're measuring? So think about that stuff. Emotion. Any type of emotion. And again, I got this little chart here, and you've seen these: happy, nervous, frustrated, angry, mad, etc. We all know that these things exist, but we have to come up with some way of measuring them. In our field, typically how we measure those is through some type of survey. So we're asking somebody to respond to a series of questions, and then typically we are going to then do some statistical analyses on those to make sure that from a statistical standpoint, what we're finding is not happening by chance, that it's actually meaning that there's something there. There's some other ways. I know that you all be exposed to research throughout the semester through some of the different scholarly journal articles that you'll read both for class and also for your course paper. And they will look at different ways of how they are measuring theory. And there are, again, a variety of ways. There's different survey questions. Some people will do interviews from a qualitative standpoint. There can also be like metadata, where you're looking at census data. You're looking at crime records for certain neighborhoods. There's all different types of ways you can get at this stuff. But again, I want you to be sure that you understand with this theory, this definition of theory, it's a set of interrelated and or intercorrelated concepts, which again is something like emotion, like some type of emotion like anger, frustration, hunger, happiness, etc. And again, it's used to explain a behavior such as crime. And criminological theories, in particular, are defined as attempts to generalize principles that can explain factors which influence offending, victimization, and rehabilitation. So that's looking at why people are committing crime. We even have a subfield in criminology called victimology, where it looks at why people are victimized. And that can be a bit controversial because some people argue that, especially for something like a sexual assault, that might endorse rape myths, but that is not the case. I can definitely see where that happens, but typically it's looking at why certain people are more likely to be victimized than others. For example, if you're of the age of a traditional college student, being about 18 to 24, you're at the highest rate of victimization of anyone in our country. But if you talk to your grandparents who might be 60, 70, 80, or older, they might think that they're most likely to be victimized, but they're not. And the reason why is we know that through victimology, and we know through testing different theories, that those that are 18 to 24 are at the highest risk for victimization of a multitude of different crimes, and that largely goes to their lifestyle. And their lifestyle is usually going out, drinking, maybe engaging a little bit more risky behaviors than you normally would, being out at all hours of the night, etc. And we also look at rehabilitation. So we can look at what factors might lead to someone not committing crime again. That tends to be what I focus on in my research, is recidivism. So what we can do to reduce someone's likelihood of reoffending, committing a crime, the same crime again, or even a different crime altogether. So when you hear criminological theories, this is what that's referring to. It's more of an umbrella concept, or not, I don't want to use the word concept here. It's more of an umbrella term, if you will, to explain, again, why people offend, sometimes why people are victimized, and sometimes how and if someone is rehabilitated from their criminal behavior. The other thing I want you to think about, and we're almost done, is that theories are usually either macro or micro. And that's one thing I want you to keep in mind as you go throughout this entire semester with all these readings. So they're either macro or micro. And one of the things I always tell my students is be sure that you know just general definitions of just general words. A lot of criminal justice and criminology is just knowing basic definitions to basic words. Macro, if you've ever heard that term before, that refers to large scales or applies to everyone in a given area. So for example, a macro theory might apply to everyone in a particular culture. When we talk about conflict theories and critical theories later on the semester, that's going to look at everyone that is in America, essentially, because it's looking at from a capitalist perspective. It's very critical of capitalism. If you look at another critical theory subfield like feminism, that's a macro theory. It applies to everyone in that particular society. You also might look at something like social disorganization theory. That's more of a macro theory because it's looking at everyone in a certain neighborhood or a certain type of neighborhood. So again, a lot of theories are either macro or micro. So as you can imagine, if macro is large scale or applies to everyone in a given area, micro is small scale or it applies to an individual in a specific circumstance. For example, I mentioned the general theory of crime, or what's commonly known as low self-control. Or self-control theory. That's looking at crime from a micro perspective. It's looking at it from an individual. Or something like labeling theory. If we label someone a criminal, typically that is categorized as a micro theory because you're looking at it from an individual perspective. So if we give somebody the label of a felon, what impact might that have on their behavior? And there's all different types of other types of theories that will fall under micro and macro. But the reason why I talk about that is I want you to have this information up front, because as you read all of our readings throughout the semester and you learn about all these different theories throughout the semester, think about if a theory is macro or if it is micro, because that's going to help you understand the implications of those particular theories. So then we need to talk about the application of theory. That's the other theme that I always run throughout this course is what are the implications of that theory? And again, that's me taking the theory from up in the clouds, as I mentioned earlier, and bringing it down to real world and real life and how we can affect positive change. So one thing I've had students ask me time and time again, and I remember when I was a student, I was asking the same questions, is can one criminological theory explain all criminal behavior? And the answer to that is no, it can't. There cannot be one magic bullet, or at least not yet, one magic bullet that explains all criminal behavior. There can't be. There might be one day, but as of right now, there can't be. There are so many different types of crimes. There's sex offenses, there's white-collar crime, there's simple assault, there's drug offenses, there's copyright infringement, there's pirating, there's all different types of things. And because human behavior is so complex, it's so distinct, criminal behavior is so complex and so distinct, we can't have one theory, or at least not yet, that does explain everything. And so what you're going to see throughout the semester is criminological theory oftentimes borrows from a lot of different disciplines. It borrows from biology, it borrows from psychology, and it borrows from sociology primarily. It also can and does borrow from anthropology and some other fields. And what we're kind of seeing our discipline do is it really didn't become its own discipline until about the 1950s, 1960s. It was a subfield of sociology for so long. Now it's really seen as its own distinct discipline. But what we're starting to see happen even more so than before is a lot of our theories are becoming integrated. So they're being combined with theories from other fields and other disciplines. And so other professors from other disciplines are working with criminologists to help beef up theories or maybe test things that somebody like myself doesn't have the expertise to test in. For example, you look at some biological theories of crime. I don't have an expertise in biology. I took one biology class in high school and I didn't do very well in it. So if I'm wanting to test a biological theory of crime, I'm going to need to team up with somebody like a biologist, maybe a professor in biology, that knows what they're doing. And perhaps they can help shed a little bit more light on the topic that I'm wanting to study. So again, keep that in mind as we go throughout this semester, is that one criminological theory cannot ever explain all criminal behavior. And the other thing I do want you to mention, you're going to see this in all of your readings, is that theory can, and it does, and it should inform criminal justice policy. Because, again, if you're just studying something for the sake of it, that's fine. But in my educated opinion, you should do more with that information. Because if it's just sitting there, what good is that going to do? And what you're going to see throughout this semester is how theory has impacted criminal justice policy. Some for the good, some for the bad. And that's one of the other things that we will keep in mind as well. There's a lot of stuff when you read scholarly journal articles, both for this class and your others, especially in criminal justice research, there's always a section at the end in the discussion that says policy implications. So what are the implications of what you're studying? How can what you're studying and what you found be applied to affect positive change? And what you'll see is theory in our discipline is not some abstract idea. It's not just there for the sake of it. Largely speaking, not always, but largely speaking, it is used, and it's supposed to be used to inform criminal justice policy. Now, does that happen all the time? Absolutely not. And I would venture to say the vast majority of the research that we do goes unread by practitioners. But the ones that are read by practitioners, in particular, tend to have a fairly positive impact. And that sometimes it has a very negative impact, and we will see that as well. And the other thing, and again, I'll just mention this again, is what we are seeing is a movement towards integrated theories. And that is what I was mentioning earlier with the combination of criminology and psychology and biology, etc. So we are starting to see this integrated approach really start to take off. So that's all I have. And this is probably the only time that you're going to hear from me this semester from a lecture standpoint. Again, as this class is primarily a seminar style class. But as always, and as I will make abundantly clear in every single one of my emails that you will see, because you will be seeing a lot from me, if you ever have any questions or concerns or comments or whatever, please do not hesitate to reach out and send me an email. You will find that I do respond very, very quickly to email. So again, please do not hesitate to send me an email, and I look forward to having each of you in class this semester.